Town thugs slapped the crippled bride in her wheelchair and destroyed her wedding vows, unaware that Daklugi, the Apache warrior who never spoke but always remembered, was standing in the shadows behind them. New Mexico Territory, autumn of 1878. The season when the cottonwoods turned gold and the wind carried whispers of winter down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The chapel stood at the edge of Santo Domingo, a small settlement that hardly deserved to be called a town. Just a scattering of adobe buildings clinging to existence in a landscape that swallowed the weak without mercy. The church itself was a testament to fading hope, its whitewashed walls peeling like old skin, the bell tower leaning slightly to the east as if bowing under the weight of too many prayers that went unanswered. The bell had not rung in 3 years, not since the circuit preacher stopped coming through and the people of Santo Domingo learned to bury their own dead without waiting for a man in a collar to tell them the proper words. Inside, the air smelled of dust and candle wax, of hope struggling against inevitable decay, and beneath it all, the faint scent of sage smoke from ceremonies that predated the church itself. Wooden pews lined both sides of the narrow aisle, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of restless hands, each plank bearing the carved initials of couples long dead, names like Martinez and O'Malley and Chen, testament to the strange mix of cultures that collided in this territory. Sunlight filtered through windows so dusty they turned the light amber, casting long shadows across the floor. At the front, near the altar, draped in faded linen, there stood a wooden cross carved by hand, simple and unadorned, and before it sat Penelope Graves. She wore a dress of cream-colored cotton, simple but carefully pressed, with lace at the collar that her mother had tatted by hand 3 decades ago when daughters were expected to marry, standing on their own 2 feet. The dress had been her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit Penelope's smaller frame, and every stitch carried memory, carried the ghost of a woman who died, giving birth to her only child. Her dark auburn hair was pinned up beneath a small crown of dried wildflowers, daisies and Indian paintbrush gathered from the hillside, where her father used to take her riding before the accident, their petals brittle but still holding color. The wheeled chair she sat in was not the fine mechanical kind advertised in catalogs from back east, but a rougher thing built by a Mexican carpenter in Santa Fe, constructed from oak and iron with wheels salvaged from an old mining cart. The kind of chair that announced its presence with every creak and groan. Penelope's hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined, knuckles white from gripping too hard, and her green eyes stared straight ahead at the empty space where a groom should have been standing, where Samuel Crowe should have been waiting with that quiet smile of his, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was still kindness left in this world. But there was no groom, not yet, just a folded piece of parchment tucked into her bodice. A marriage contract signed in ink and witnessed by a traveling notary 3 days prior. A document that said she and Samuel Crowe, the half-Apache ranch hand who worked the land adjacent to hers, were legally bound in matrimony, whether the town approved or not, whether the territorial government recognized it or not. Whether God himself smiled on it or turned his face away, this was not a wedding born of romance, though there had been tenderness between them in the quiet hours when no one else was watching. Moments when he brought her water from the well without being asked, when he fixed the wheel on her chair without making her feel helpless, when he sat beside her on the porch and they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence because some things did not need words. This was survival. This was 2 people who understood that the world did not care about their happiness or their suffering, that the only protection they had was each other, that a contract and a marriage license meant the difference between keeping her land and losing everything her father died to protect. After her father, Captain Richard Graves of the Union Army, died from infected wounds 2 winters ago, the vultures began circling, men in fine hats who spoke of liens and debts and foreclosure with smiles that never reached their eyes. The land her father bled for, The 160 acres he won in a poker game and defended with his life was now being claimed by men who never risked anything but other people's money. There was Clayton Hargrave, the territorial land assessor who always discovered unpaid taxes whenever valuable property changed hands, who wore suits that cost more than Penelope's entire house. There were the investors from Denver and St. Louis, faceless names on documents demanding payment for loans Penelope had never heard of. Penelope had tried every legal avenue, every appeal to judges who looked at her wheeled chair and saw only helplessness. So she did what her father taught her when the law failed. She found another way. Marriage to Samuel Crowe meant the land stayed in family hands, meant protection under territorial statutes that favored married settlers over single women, meant one more day of holding on to the only thing she had left in this world. The only connection to her father, besides the memories that grew fainter with each passing season. But Samuel was not here, not yet. He had ridden to Santa Fe 3 days ago to file the contract, and he promised he would return by sundown. And Penelope had wheeled herself to this chapel alone because she needed to sit in this space, needed to feel what it might be like to be married in the eyes of God, even if the law was all they really needed. She closed her eyes and imagined the vows she would never speak aloud. To have and to hold in sickness and in health, till death do us part. That was when the door slammed open. The sound echoed through the chapel like a gunshot, violent and deliberate, and Penelope's eyes snapped open, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. 3 men entered, their boots heavy on the floorboards, making more noise than necessary because they wanted her to hear them coming. Wanted her to feel their presence like a physical weight pressing down on her. And their laughter was coarse and sharp like broken glass, the kind of laughter that has cruelty at its core. At the center was Clayton Hargrave, the territorial land assessor, a man with slicked back hair, the color of old brass, and a silver watch chain that caught the light as he moved. His eyes small and mean like a pig's eyes, his mouth twisted into a permanent sneer that suggested he had never encountered a rule he could not bend or a person he could not break. Never met anyone he considered truly equal, because he measured worth in dollars, and everyone was either above him or beneath him with no middle ground. He wore a black suit with a brocade vest, the kind of clothes that announced wealth and importance. That said, he was a man of substance and power, that demanded respect even from people who hated him, and his boots were polished to a shine that seemed obscene in a place like Santo Domingo, where most people wore whatever kept their feet from freezing. Flanking him were 2 hired guns, men whose names Penelope did not know and did not care to learn because they were interchangeable parts in Hargrave's machine, one tall and rail-thin, with a scar splitting his left eyebrow. His face all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, like something carved from wood by an angry hand. The other shorter and broader, with hands large and knuckled like hammerheads. His neck thick as a fence post, and his eyes dull with the kind of stupidity that made him dangerous because he never questioned orders. Clayton stopped halfway down the aisle and let out a low whistle. Theatrical and mocking. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with exaggerated surprise. "What do we have here? A wedding, and the bride came all by herself. How very modern, how very independent." His companions laughed on cue, the sound harsh and grating. Penelope turned her head slowly, her expression calm, but her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird throwing itself at cage bars. And she kept her voice level, even though fear was rising in her throat like bile. "Mr. Hargrave," she said evenly, "this is a house of worship. You have no business here." Clayton laughed, a sound without warmth, without any genuine emotion, except maybe satisfaction at finding her alone and vulnerable. And he began walking toward her, his boots clicking against the wood in a rhythm that felt deliberate, predatory, like a wolf circling wounded prey. "Oh, but I do have business here, Miss Graves," he said, stopping just a few feet from her chair, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath and the pomade in his hair. "I have business anywhere land deeds and contracts are concerned. And I heard a very interesting rumor that you tried to pull a fast one on me." Penelope lifted her chin, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear in her eyes, even though it was there. Cold and heavy in her stomach, I signed a legal marriage contract, she said, each word measured and firm. My land is protected under territorial law. You have no claim to it. Clayton crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, close enough that she could see the burst capillaries in his cheeks from too much whiskey, the yellowed edges of his teeth from too much tobacco, the tiny cruelties written in every line of his face. Protected, he repeated softly, his voice dangerous now. Protected by what exactly? A piece of paper and a half-breed who is not even here to defend you. Protected by laws that only matter when someone with power decides to enforce them. The scarred man snickered from behind, and the broader one cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing through the empty chapel like bones breaking. Like a promise of violence, Penelope's jaw tightened, muscles bunching beneath her skin, but she kept her voice steady, even as anger began to burn through her fear. Samuel Crowe is a free man and a landowner, she said. Our marriage is legitimate under territorial statute, and you know it. Which is why you are here trying to intimidate me instead of filing a legal challenge. Clayton stood abruptly, his face darkening, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the rage beneath. He turned to his men, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. "Did you hear that, boys?" he said, voice rising. "She thinks a cripple and a savage can outsmart the territorial government. She thinks she can just wheel herself into a church and pretend she is a real bride with a real future instead of what she actually is, which is a burden waiting to be disposed of." The men laughed, and something dark and cold settled in Penelope's chest. Recognition that this was not just about intimidation anymore, that something worse was coming. Clayton turned back to her, his expression hardening into something cruel and final. "Let me tell you something, Miss Graves," he said, leaning down again and gripping the arms of her chair with both hands. "Your little plan is not going to work. Samuel Crowe is never coming back from Santa Fe. We made sure of that." Penelope's breath caught in her throat, the world tilting sideways. "What did you do?" she whispered. The words barely audible. Clayton smiled, and it was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. Let us just say he had an unfortunate encounter on the road. Tragic, really, but these things happen in such dangerous times. Accidents with rattlesnakes, falls from horses. Sometimes people just disappear, and no one ever finds out what happened to them. Rage flared hot and bright in Penelope's chest, burning away the fear. And before she could stop herself, the words were coming out. "You murdered him." Clayton shrugged. "I did not do anything personally. I was in my office all day with witnesses, but yes, your half-breed husband met with an accident, which means your marriage contract is void, which means your land reverts to the territory for unpaid debts, which means you have about 24 hours to pack your things before my men come to take possession." Penelope gripped the arms of her chair, her whole body trembling with fury. "You will not get away with this," she said, her voice shaking. "People will know what you did." Clayton laughed again. "Who is going to tell them you, a crippled woman with no family and no friends and no credibility? Or maybe you think the law will help you, the same law that has been ignoring your complaints for 2 years. The same judges who are on my payroll." He straightened up and gestured to the scarred man. "Teach her some manners," he said casually, like he was asking someone to water his horse. The scarred man stepped forward with a grin, and before Penelope could react, he grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back hard enough to make her gasp. Pain shot through her scalp, bright and sharp, and her hands flew up instinctively to grab his wrist, trying to pull his fingers loose. "What did you say earlier, sweetheart?" the man growled, his breath hot against her face, something about knowing your place. Penelope gritted her teeth, and even through the pain, even knowing what was coming, she forced the words out. "I said," she hissed, "that only cowards hurt women." The slap came fast and brutal, his palm connecting with her cheek, with enough force to snap her head to the side, to fill her mouth with the taste of copper, to make stars burst behind her eyes. Her vision blurred, the chapel spinning around her, and she felt the chair tilting, felt herself falling. Her shoulder struck the edge of the pew first. Then her head hit the floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo through her skull. And for a moment everything went white. The wildflower crown tumbled free, petals scattering across the dusty wood like tiny pieces of her broken dreams. She lay there gasping, her cheek pressed against the cold floor, blood trickling from her split lip, and above her she could hear their laughter. Cruel and triumphant. The chair had rolled away, its wooden wheels creaking, and she was on the ground now, helpless, unable to stand, unable to defend herself. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt truly defeated. Clayton's voice came from somewhere above her. "That is what happens when you do not know your place," he said, "and now you are going to learn it properly." The scarred man raised his boot, preparing to kick the overturned chair, and Penelope closed her eyes, waiting for more pain, but it never came. Instead, there was a sound, barely audible, the whisper of leather against wood. Then a voice, harsh and startled, from the scarred man, "What the—" And suddenly his hand was torn from her hair, his body jerking backward like he had been grabbed by something immensely strong. Penelope opened her eyes, vision still blurred, and saw a figure standing behind the scarred man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin with long black hair loose around his shoulders. Daklugi, the Apache warrior who worked Samuel's land, who had been there in the background for as long as Penelope could remember. Always watching, always silent, his hand was clamped on the scarred man's shoulder, and even from the ground, Penelope could see the way his fingers dug in, could see the scarred man's face contorting in pain. Daklugi's expression was calm, almost serene, but his dark eyes burned with something ancient and unforgiving. Something that predated churches and laws and the empty promises of civilization. He did not speak. He never did. His tongue had been cut out years ago by soldiers who thought silence was the same as defeat. But his presence spoke louder than any words could. With one fluid motion, he twisted the scarred man's arm and shoved him forward, sending him sprawling onto the floor beside Penelope with a crash that splintered floorboards. The broader man charged, fists swinging wild, but Daklugi moved like water, like wind, sidestepping effortlessly and redirecting the man's momentum into the nearest pew, which cracked and splintered under the impact. Clayton stumbled backward, his hand going for the revolver at his hip, but Daklugi was already there, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides, and his hand closed around Clayton's wrist, bending it backward until the gun clattered to the floor. Clayton yelped, his face white with pain and terror, and Daklugi leaned in close, his face inches from Clayton's, and though no words passed between them, the message was clear: "Touch her again and you die." He released Clayton with a shove that sent the man stumbling backward into his groaning companions, and for a long moment the 3 of them stood there, bloodied and humiliated, staring at the silent warrior who had appeared from nowhere and dismantled them in seconds. Clayton spat blood onto the floor, his eyes full of hate. "This is not over," he snarled. "We will be back with the sheriff, with the army if we have to. You just assaulted a government official." Daklugi said nothing, did nothing, just stood there watching them with that same calm, terrifying stillness. Clayton gestured frantically to his men. "Get up," he snapped. "We are leaving, but mark my words. Both of you are finished." They limped toward the door, dragging themselves out into the fading sunlight, and the chapel fell silent once more. Daklugi stood motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling slowly, his eyes still fixed on the doorway as if expecting them to return. Then, with movements as gentle as they had been violent seconds before, he turned and knelt beside Penelope. She was still lying on her side, one hand pressed to her bleeding lip, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. Tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from rage, from helplessness, from the unbearable weight of everything she had lost and everything she was still losing. Sateed, Daklugi reached out slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal, and his hand touched her shoulder with surprising tenderness. She looked up at him through blurred vision, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then something broke inside her, all the strength she had been holding on to for 2 years. all the stubborn pride that kept her going, and a sob tore from her throat. She reached for him, her fingers clutching at his buckskin shirt, and Daklugi carefully, reverently, lifted her back into her chair, his movements slow and deliberate, his touch gentle despite the violence those same hands had just unleashed. He retrieved the scattered wildflowers one by one, his large, scarred hands handling the brittle petals with impossible delicacy, and placed them in her lap. When he finished, he stepped back and met her gaze, and Penelope understood something she had never fully grasped before. Daklugi had always been there, watching from the edges of her life, keeping her safe without asking for anything in return, a shadow that moved through her world with the quiet devotion of someone who had chosen her long before she ever knew to look for him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing blood and tears across her cheek, and took a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty chapel. Daklugi nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his head that somehow conveyed more than 1,000 words could, and as the last light of day filtered through the dusty windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, Penelope Graves realized that maybe Samuel Crow was not coming back. Maybe he was already dead somewhere on the road to Santa Fe. But she was not alone. She had never been alone. The sun had dipped below the western ridge by the time Daklugi carried Penelope back to her father's ranch. The sky bleeding red and purple like an open wound, shadows stretching long across the desert floor where cactus stood like sentinels, and the wind carried the smell of creosote and dust. He moved through the failing light with the sure-footedness of someone who knew this land in his bones, who could navigate by starlight and instinct when other men would be lost. His moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth, his breathing steady despite the weight of woman and chair both. Penelope had insisted he bring the chair, had refused to leave it behind, even though it slowed them down, because that chair was more than wood and iron. It was her independence, her ability to move through the world without begging for help from people who saw her as a burden. The ranch house appeared as a dark shape against the darkening sky, a single-story adobe structure with a covered porch and shuttered windows, modest but solid, built by her father's hands 20 years ago when he first claimed this land and believed hard work and honest sweat could make a life worth living. Daklugi set her down gently on the porch steps, then went back for the chair, positioning it beside her with the same careful attention he brought to everything he did. And when she was settled, he stepped back. Waiting, Penelope looked up at him, her face still swollen from the blow, her lips split and crusted with dried blood, and tried to find words adequate to what had just happened. "You saved my life," she said finally, her voice rough. Daklugi shook his head slowly, a slight movement that might have been missed if she was not watching closely. "No," she insisted, "if you had not been there, they would have killed me or worse." He held her gaze for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable in the gathering dusk. Then he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled something out, a small carved figure no bigger than his thumb, and placed it carefully in her hand. She looked down, her fingers tracing the shape, a bird with outstretched wings, every feather rendered in miniature, the wood smooth and warm from being carried close to his body. It was beautiful, impossibly delicate, the kind of thing that required patience and skill and a steadiness of hand that spoke of deep practice. "When did you make this?" she asked. Daklugi pointed to himself, then made a gesture with his hands that suggested time passing, many days, then pointed to her. "For me," she whispered, "you made this for me." He nodded once. "Why?" He touched his chest, over his heart, then pointed to her, and the meaning was clear even without words. "Because you matter, because I see you, because some things do not need reasons." Penelope felt tears rising again, hot and unwelcome, and she clutched the carved bird tightly. "I do not understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Why do you stay here? Why do you help me when everyone else has either left or turned against me?" Daklugi crouched down so they were eye level, And he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then to hers over her heart. The gesture said everything. We are the same. We are both alone. We are both fighting to exist in a world that wants us gone. Then he stood and turned toward the darkening desert, his posture alert, listening. What is it? Penelope asked, sitting up straighter. He held up one hand, a signal for silence. His head tilted slightly, and in the distance came the sound she had been dreading. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast. They are coming back, she said. Her stomach dropping, Daklugi nodded, then moved quickly to the door, tested it, found it unlocked, and pushed it open. He gestured for her to go inside, urgency in every line of his body. What about you? She asked. He pointed to the roof, then to the surrounding rocks, indicating he would take a position where he could see them coming, where he could defend if needed. You cannot fight them all, she said desperately. There will be more this time. Hargrave will bring the sheriff, maybe even soldiers. Daklugi met her eyes, his expression calm, accepting, and he touched his knife hilt, then pointed at her again, the message clear. I will fight as long as I have breath, because you are worth defending. Then he was gone, melting into the shadows like smoke. And Penelope was alone on the porch, with the sound of approaching horses growing louder. She wheeled herself inside quickly, her arms burning with effort, and closed the door, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The interior of the house was dark, just the faint glow of banked coals in the fireplace. And she moved by memory to the table where her father kept his weapons, a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver, both cleaned and oiled, because Richard Graves believed a man who let his guns rust deserved whatever fate came for him. She checked the rifle first, working the lever action with practiced ease. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 10, had believed that anyone living on the frontier needed to know how to defend themselves, regardless of what society said about proper ladies and firearms. The rifle was loaded, 6 rounds in the magazine, and she set it across her lap, then checked the revolver. All 6 chambers full. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Voices carried in the night air, rough and angry. Men emboldened by numbers and righteousness, convinced they were doing the law's work. Penelope Graves, a voice called out. This is Sheriff Marcus Webb. I have a warrant for your arrest and for the arrest of the Apache known as Daklugi on charges of assault on a government official. Chew. She said nothing, her hands tight on the rifle. Miss Graves, the sheriff continued, you need to come out peacefully. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. We just want to talk. That was a lie. They did not ride out here at night with a posse just to talk. They came to take her land and probably kill Daklugi in the process. Call it resisting arrest or attacking an officer. Whatever story justified the violence. She heard Clayton Hargrave's voice next, smug and satisfied. She is in there, Sheriff. Probably got that savage with her. You should just burn them out. Save everyone the trouble of a trial. The sheriff's response was quieter. But Penelope caught enough, something about proper procedure, about doing things by the book, and she realized he was not as eager as Hargrave to commit murder, which meant there was still a chance. She wheeled over to the window, staying low, and peered through a gap in the shutters. 6 men on horseback, maybe 7. It was hard to tell in the darkness. The sheriff in front with his badge catching the moonlight, Hargrave beside him, and behind them the hired guns and local men recruited for the posse, the kind who would follow orders and not ask questions as long as there was money involved. Where was Daklugi? She scanned the roofline, the rocks beyond, but saw nothing. He had vanished completely. Miss Graves, the sheriff called again. This is your last warning. Come out now or we are coming in. She made a decision. Moving quickly, she opened the shutter just enough to be heard and shouted back. Sheriff Webb, I am a citizen with property rights under territorial law. You have no cause to arrest me. There was a pause. Then the sheriff responded. Mr. Hargrave filed a complaint that you and an Apache man assaulted him and his associates in the church this afternoon. That is cause enough. He attacked me first, Penelope shouted. He admitted to murdering Samuel Crow. There are witnesses. What witnesses? Hargrave called back mockingly. That mute savage who cannot testify in any court. She gritted her teeth, knowing he was right. Apache testimony was not admissible in territorial courts. The law did not recognize them as credible witnesses, which meant anything Daklugi saw or did could not be used in her defense. Sheriff, she tried again, you know Clayton Hargrave has been trying to steal my land for 2 years. This is not about justice. This is about theft. The sheriff sounded uncomfortable now. That is a matter for the courts, Miss Graves. Right now I have a warrant and I intend to serve it. So you can come out on your own or we will come get you. If you try to enter my property without my consent, she said clearly, I will defend myself as the law allows. There was a longer pause. The sound of men talking in low voices, arguing. Then Hargrave's voice rose sharp and clear. She just threatened a peace officer. That is enough, boys. Go get her. Penelope heard the creak of saddle leather, the sound of men dismounting, boots hitting the ground. She raised the rifle and fired a shot through the shutter, not aiming at anyone. Just a warning shot that cracked through the night like thunder. The men scattered, shouting, diving for cover. Hold your fire, the sheriff yelled. Nobody shoot back, that is an order. But not everyone listened. A rifle barked from the posse, the bullet slamming into the adobe wall near the window. And suddenly the night exploded with gunfire. Penelope ducked, her heart hammering, as bullets punched through the shutters. Wood splintering, adobe dust filling the air. She wheeled backward away from the window and took up a position behind the heavy wooden table her father had built. Flipping it on its side for cover, the shooting stopped as quickly as it started. Men yelling at each other, the sheriff trying to regain control. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. A scream, high and sharp with pain and terror. Everyone went silent. What the hell was that? Someone shouted, It is the Apache. Another voice yelled, He's out there. More shouting, confusion. The sound of horses panicking, rearing up. Penelope risked a glance through the broken shutter and saw chaos. Men running. One lying on the ground, clutching his leg. Another stumbling backward with an arrow protruding from his shoulder. Daklugi had struck from the darkness, silent and devastating. And now the posse was breaking apart, fear replacing their earlier confidence. Get back, the sheriff was yelling. Regroup, form a line. But his men were not listening. They were scared, faced with an enemy they could not see, could not predict. An enemy who moved like a ghost and struck like lightning. One of Hargrave's hired guns fired wildly into the darkness, the muzzle flash bright and brief, and immediately an arrow hissed through the air and took him in the thigh, sending him down screaming. Fall back, the sheriff ordered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His voice, desperate now, fall back to the horses. The posse retreated in disorder, men helping their wounded, casting terrified glances at the shadows. And within minutes they were mounted and riding hard back toward town, leaving only dust and blood behind. Penelope sat in the darkness of her house, heart pounding, hardly believing what had just happened. One man, one silent Apache warrior, had driven off 7 armed men. She waited, listening, as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Then came the soft sound of moccasins on the porch. Barely audible, Daklugi appeared in the doorway, his bow still in hand, his face expressionless. And he looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that asked the question without words. Are you hurt? She shook her head. I am fine, she said, but you, are you injured? He shook his head, then stepped inside and began moving through the house, checking the walls, assessing the damage. Bullet holes in the shutters, one window shattered. But the structure was sound. They will come back, Penelope said quietly. Hargrave will not give up. He will bring more men, maybe federal marshals, and next time they will not be so easy to scare. Daklugi nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. Then he pulled out his knife and began carving something into the doorframe, working quickly. What are you doing? She asked. He did not answer, just kept carving. And when he finished, she could see it was a symbol, angular and precise, Apache markings that she did not understand. "What does it mean?" He pointed to the symbol, then to himself, then made a circular gesture that encompassed the house. The land, everything. She understood. "It means this place is under your protection," he nodded. "But why?" she asked again. The question that kept coming back. "Why do you care so much about me? About this land that is not even yours?" Daklugi stood very still, thinking. And then he did something unexpected. He began to sign, using hand gestures that some Apache and Plains tribes shared, a language of motion that Penelope had seen before when her father traded with native bands. She knew only a little of it, but she watched carefully as his hands moved, telling a story. He pointed to himself, then made the sign for child, for boy, then the sign for soldier. "For bluecoats, Union soldiers?" she said. He nodded, then his hands moved faster, showing pain, showing capture, and his fingers went to his mouth. Pulling out, cutting. "They cut out your tongue," she whispered, horrified. He nodded again, his face still calm, but something burning in his eyes. Then he pointed at her legs, and made the sign for broken, for unable to walk. His hands moved again, showing suffering, showing people who laugh, who mock, who see only the brokenness and not the person. "We are the same," Penelope said softly. "We have both been made less than human in their eyes." Daklugi's hands moved again, making the sign for fight, for resist, for survive. Then he pointed to her father's grave marker visible through the broken window, and made the sign for honor, for debt. "You knew my father," she said with sudden realization. He nodded, and his hands told another story of a young Apache boy captured by Comancheros, beaten and starved, sold to a band of renegades who planned to trade him back to his people for guns. "And my father," Daklugi's hands moved, showing a man on horseback, showing violence, showing the boy set free. "He saved you," she breathed. Daklugi nodded, and for the first time since she had known him, something like emotion crossed his face, grief and gratitude mixed together. He made more signs, showing years passing, showing himself learning to survive, learning to fight, returning to find her father already dead, but finding her, alone and struggling and making a choice. "To stay," Penelope finished, "to protect me as he once protected you." He touched his chest, then pointed at her, the gesture that said, "You are my people, you are my reason." Tears were running down Penelope's face now, her throat tight with emotion. "I never knew," she said, "I never knew any of this." Daklugi shrugged slightly, as if to say, "You were not meant to. Some debts are paid in silence." They sat together in the damaged house as the night deepened around them, two people who had lost everything that mattered except each other. And Penelope understood that this was not just about land or survival anymore. This was about choosing to stand with someone when the whole world wanted them to fall. Penelope looked at the carved bird still clutched in her hand, then back at Daklugi, seeing him truly for the first time, not as a silent shadow who fixed things and disappeared, but as a person with his own story of pain and resilience. His own reasons for staying when leaving would have been easier. "How long?" she asked softly. "How long have you been watching over me?" Daklugi held up his fingers, counting out months, then years. 2 full years since her father died. 2 years, she repeated, and I never knew, never understood what you were doing. He shrugged, a gesture that said it did not matter. That understanding was not required, only the doing. But Penelope felt something shift inside her, a recognition of debt that went deeper than gratitude, a connection that had been forming in silence, while she was too focused on her own struggles to see it. "I've been so selfish," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "so caught up in my own problems that I never asked about you, never wondered where you came from, or why you stayed, or what you needed." Daklugi shook his head firmly, disagreeing, and he made signs that said, "You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to stay in a world that has no place for me. We are both ghosts," Penelope said quietly. "Both invisible to the people who make the rules and decide who matters." He nodded, then made another sign, 2 hands coming together, "Join together we are stronger," she translated. He smiled then, a rare expression that transformed his usually stoic face, making him look younger, almost peaceful. The moment was interrupted by a sound from outside. Distant but distinct, more hoofbeats. Penelope tensed. They are coming back already. But Daklugi held up his hand, listening carefully, then shook his head and signed friend. A single rider approached slowly, hands visible, and Penelope recognized Miguel Sandoval, an old friend of her father's, who owned property to the south. Daklugi nodded, and Miguel dismounted, his weathered face grave. "Madre de Dios," he breathed, seeing the bullet holes. "They actually shot at you." "They came with a warrant," Penelope said. "But Daklugi drove them off." Miguel looked at the Apache with new respect. "One man against 7, remarkable." He stepped closer. "Urgent, Penelope, you cannot stay here. Hargrave will come back with more men, maybe federal troops. Where would I go?" she asked. "This is my home. Come to my ranch until we figure out how to fight this legally." "If I leave," Penelope replied, "Hargrave will claim I abandoned the property." Miguel sighed, knowing she was right, then pulled a bundle from his saddle. "At least take this, ammunition and supplies." She accepted gratefully, and Miguel mounted his horse. "If you need anything, send Daklugi to my ranch. My family owes your father a debt." He rode off, and Penelope and Daklugi were alone again. She unwrapped Miguel's bundle and found 50 rounds of rifle ammunition, jerky, hardtack, and a small bottle of laudanum for pain. Practical gifts from a practical man who understood what was coming. Daklugi touched her shoulder gently, then pointed inside. She nodded. "Yes, we should get some rest while we can." But as she wheeled back inside, she knew neither of them would really sleep tonight. They would take turns watching, waiting for the next attack, because it was coming as surely as the dawn. Daklugi helped her move the table back upright, and they sat on opposite sides, the rifle between them, and in the quiet Penelope found herself studying his face. "Did you have a family?" she asked before the soldiers. His expression clouded, and he nodded. His hands moved in signs that told the old story of the Apache wars, of camps burned, of families scattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shrugged, accepting, then signed carefully, pointing to the land to her. "Your father showed me not all white men are enemies, and when he died, I knew you would need someone who understood both worlds." "You are more than protection," Penelope said firmly. "You are family." Daklugi's eyes widened with surprise, and he touched his chest, then pointed at her, questioning. "Yes," she said, "I mean it. Whatever happens, we face it together as family." He knelt before her and took her hand, the gesture binding. "We will win this," she said, "not just for land, but for the right to exist, to be seen as human." Outside, the desert stretched vast and indifferent under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in the darkness, Clayton Hargrave was planning his next move, gathering more men, buying more authority, preparing for a final assault. But for now, in this moment, Penelope Graves was not alone, and that made all the difference. Dawn came cold and grey, the sun hidden behind clouds that rolled in from the mountains. Heavy with the promise of rain, Penelope woke to find Daklugi already gone, though she had not heard him leave, and panic seized her until she spotted him on the roof. Checking the structure, she wheeled to the door and called up. "Find anything?" He held up 3 fingers, pointing to sections where the timber was rotted. "Can you fix it?" He made a gesture that meant maybe. If there was time, she understood Hargrave would not wait long. Penelope spent the morning taking inventory of their supplies and fortifications, counting ammunition, checking food stores, filling every bucket and barrel with water from the well, because if they were besieged, they would need it. 23 rounds for the rifle, 18 for the revolver. Enough for a sustained fight, but not a long one. And once the ammunition was gone, they would be defenseless. Food was better. Miguel's supplies, plus what she already had, meant they could hold out for a week if they rationed carefully. But water was the real concern. The well was outside, exposed, and if Hargrave's men took control of it, they could force surrender through thirst alone. She was organizing the medical supplies, such as they were when she heard hoofbeats again. multiple horses moving fast, and her heart jumped into her throat. Daklugi dropped from the roof in a controlled fall that should have broken his ankles, but left him landing in a crouch, bow already in hand, and he positioned himself behind the water trough. Using it for cover, Penelope grabbed the rifle and wheeled to the window. But as the riders came into view, she realized these were not Hargrave's men. There were 5 of them, all Apache, dressed in a mix of traditional clothing and pieces scavenged from the white world, and they rode with the easy confidence of men who knew this land better than any map could show. Daklugi stepped out from behind the trough, lowering his bow, and made a series of quick hand signs. The lead rider, an older man with grey streaking his long black hair tied with red cloth and a face carved from weathered leather that spoke of 60 winters survived in a land that killed most men before 40, signed back in a rapid exchange that suggested familiarity and respect, then dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. The others followed his lead, spreading out in a loose semicircle that was not quite threatening, but made it clear they were ready for violence if it came. And Penelope realized with a chill that these were not reservation Apache content to live on government rations. These were warriors, men who had fought in the Apache wars and survived through skill and cunning, who carried that survival in every cautious movement and every calculating glance. Daklugi and the older man clasped forearms in the warrior greeting. Then began a rapid exchange of sign language that Penelope could not follow, too fast and too complex for her limited understanding. Their hands moving in patterns that told stories and asked questions and gave orders, all without a single spoken word. After several minutes of this silent conversation, Daklugi turned and gestured for her to come out, his expression suggesting this was important. She hesitated for just a moment, very aware of how vulnerable she was. A crippled white woman facing 5 Apache warriors who had every reason to hate her kind for the decades of broken treaties and massacres and forced relocations, who could kill her in seconds if they chose, and no law would care. But she had learned to trust Daklugi's judgment, and so she wheeled onto the porch with as much dignity as she could muster, keeping her hands visible and empty in a gesture of peace. The older man studied her with dark eyes that missed nothing, taking in every detail. The bruised face that was still swollen despite a day of healing, the wheeled chair with its rough construction, the rifle that was now leaning against the doorframe rather than held, the way her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and fear, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite sympathy, because Apache warriors did not offer sympathy to enemies, but a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement that she too was a survivor. He spoke in English, heavily accented but perfectly clear, each word chosen with care. I am Nantan, which means leader in your tongue, war chief of the Mescalero band that camps in the Sacramento Mountains, where the government cannot easily find us. Daklugi tells me you give him shelter and food when others would drive him away, that you treat him as family and not as slave or servant. This is unusual for a white woman. Penelope met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away despite every instinct screaming that she should show deference. He is family, she said simply, letting the words carry their full weight. He saved my life when men came to kill me. And before that he watched over me when I had no one else. So yes, he is my family, and I would die to protect him as he would die to protect me. Nantan nodded slowly, a gesture that suggested approval. He tells me also that white men come to steal your land, that they claim legal right but use illegal methods, that they will kill you both if they can, because you stand in the way of their greed. That is true, Penelope confirmed. They have already murdered the man I was to marry, and today they will come with many guns to finish what they started. Nantan studied her for a long moment, then asked the question she had been dreading. Why do you not leave? Take what you can carry and go to the city where there are laws and courts that might protect you, because the laws do not protect people like us, she said, her voice steady now. They protect men with money and power. Men like Clayton Hargrave who can buy judges and sheriffs. and the courts belong to them. If I run, they win. They take everything my father died for, and I will not give them that satisfaction. I would rather die here than live knowing I surrendered without a fight." Nantan studied her for a long moment, then turned to his men and spoke in Apache, rapid and emphatic. And two of them laughed while the others nodded. He turned back to Penelope. "My men say you have the heart of a warrior, even if your legs do not work. They say this is good, that people who refuse to die are the most dangerous enemies." Penelope was not sure if that was a compliment or a warning, but she nodded. "Why are you here?" Nantan gestured to Daklugi. "He is my sister's son, my blood. When he was taken by the Comancheros, we thought him dead. When he returned with no tongue, we thought him broken. But he is neither dead nor broken, only changed. Understanding dawned. You came because he asked for help." Nantan shook his head. "He asked for nothing. He never asks. But we watch. We know what happens in the valley. We know that the land assessor is a snake who has stolen from many people, white and Mexican and Apache alike, and we know that today or tomorrow he will come with many men. So you came to fight?" Nantan smiled, a cold expression that held no humor. "We came to watch, to bear witness, because what happens here matters. If one woman in a chair and one warrior with no voice can stand against the thieves, then perhaps there is still honor in this territory. Will you help us if they attack?" Nantan's smile faded. "If we fight beside you, the army will call it an uprising. They will send soldiers to hunt my people. Women and children will die, so no, we cannot fight your battle." Disappointment settled heavy in Penelope's chest, but she understood. But Nantan continued, "We will watch, and what we see we will tell to others. And sometimes the truth is a weapon sharper than knives." He gave orders to his men in Apache, and they began to disperse. 3 heading up into the rocks above the ranch, where they would have clear views of the property. 1 staying with the horses, and 1, a young warrior with a scarred face. Positioning himself near the well, Nantan turned back to Penelope. "We will not interfere unless the fight becomes murder. If they try to burn you alive or hang you without trial, then we will act, because that is not war, that is cowardice. But if it is a fair fight, then you must win or lose on your own strength." "I understand," Penelope said. "And thank you, even witnessing matters." Nantan nodded to Daklugi, signed something brief, then mounted his horse and rode a short distance away, taking up a position where he could observe without being easily seen. Daklugi came to stand beside Penelope's chair. She looked up at him. "You have a family," she said softly. "People who care about you." He nodded, then signed, "But you are also family, and sometimes we choose our family as much as we are born into it." She reached up and squeezed his hand. "Then we are both lucky." The morning stretched on, tense and waiting, clouds thickening overhead until the sun was completely hidden, and the air took on that electric quality that precedes storms. Penelope tried to eat, but her stomach was knotted with anticipation. Tried to rest, but her mind would not stop racing through scenarios. What if they came with 20 men? What if they had a cannon? What if the sheriff brought federal marshals who would arrest the Apache witnesses? Around noon, the wind picked up, gusting hard enough to raise dust devils in the yard and make the house creak. And far off to the east came the low rumble of thunder. Daklugi stiffened, listening, then signed to her. "They come. How many?" He held up both hands, fingers spread, then repeated the gesture, 20 or more. Penelope's heart sank. They were outnumbered 4-1, and that was if you counted her as a fighter, which any rational assessment would not. She wheeled to the window and waited. They appeared as a dark mass on the horizon, riders spread out in a loose formation, moving with the confident swagger of men who knew they had overwhelming force. And at their head rode Clayton Hargrave on his expensive horse, flanked by Sheriff Webb and at least a dozen men wearing badges that gleamed in the grey light. Deputies? Penelope realized with a sinking feeling. He had convinced the sheriff to deputize a private army, which meant this would be presented as a legal action, an arrest rather than a lynching. And that made it infinitely more dangerous because it gave them the veneer of legitimacy. Beside the deputies rode men she recognized from town, shopkeepers and ranchers who had always been friendly to her father, but were now riding with Hargrave, either bought or intimidated into service, and behind them came the hired guns, professional killers who cared nothing for law or justice, only for payment. They stopped 100 yards from the house, well out of rifle range, and began to dismount in a coordinated fashion that spoke of planning and rehearsal. And Penelope saw they were carrying more than just rifles. There were shotguns for close work. A man setting up what looked like a small artillery piece on a wheeled mount, probably a mountain howitzer left over from the war, and several men with torches already lit despite the daylight, the flames whipping in the wind. They planned to burn her out if she refused to surrender, to smoke her from her home like an animal from a den, and the presence of the artillery meant they were prepared to shell the house into rubble if necessary. Daklugi studied their formation with the eye of someone who had fought against cavalry and infantry both, and he signed to Penelope, "They are too organized. Someone with military experience is commanding them." She looked more carefully and recognized one of the men near Hargrave, a tall figure with a grey beard and a Union officer's coat, Captain Weathers, a man who had served with her father but had fallen into debt and drink after the war, now apparently selling his tactical knowledge to the highest bidder. Her father would have been ashamed to see him here. Sheriff Webb rode forward alone, his horse picking its way carefully across the rocky ground, stopping at 50 yards, and his voice when he called out carried both authority and reluctance. "Miss Graves, this is your final opportunity to surrender peacefully without bloodshed. I have a warrant signed by Judge Harrison charging you with assault and conspiracy, and I have 20 sworn deputies prepared to enforce it. There is no possible way for you to win this confrontation, so please, I am asking you woman to woman, do not make this harder than it needs to be. Do not throw your life away for pride." Penelope wheeled onto the porch, with Daklugi standing behind her in the doorway, like a sentinel carved from stone, and she shouted back with all the force her lungs could muster, "Sheriff Webb, you are a decent man who has been corrupted by indecent circumstances. You know this is wrong. You know Hargrave is a thief who has stolen from half the people in this territory. You know he murdered Samuel Crow to prevent my marriage, and you are helping him because he either paid you or threatened you or both. But either way, when this is done and the smoke clears, you will have to live with what you did here. You will have to look at yourself in the mirror and see a man who helped burn a crippled woman alive because she would not surrender her dead father's land." The sheriff looked uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle, his hand moving to adjust his hat in a gesture that betrayed his inner turmoil. "I'm enforcing a legal warrant issued by a territorial judge. That is my duty as an officer of the law." "Legal?" Penelope shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. "There is nothing legal about this. You have deputized known criminals and hired guns. You are preparing to attack a citizen on her own property with artillery. This is not law enforcement. This is tyranny dressed up in badges and warrants. This is exactly what my father fought against in the war." Hargrave rode forward to join the sheriff, his face twisted with anger. "Enough talk," he snapped. "She has been given every chance. Now we take what is ours by right." The sheriff hesitated. "Give her 5 minutes to consider." "No," Hargrave said flatly. "We have wasted enough time on this cripple and her pet savage. Burn them out." The sheriff turned to Hargrave, and for a moment it looked like he might object. But then he just slumped in his saddle and nodded. 2 men with torches started forward. Penelope raised the rifle. "If you try to burn this house with me inside, I will shoot, and I will not aim for the ground." The men stopped, looking back at the sheriff uncertainly. "She is threatening peace officers," Hargrave shouted. "That is grounds for immediate action. Take her." The sheriff sighed. "All right," he called out. "You heard her? She has refused to surrender and has made threats against deputies. We are authorized to use force." He gave the signal and the line of men began to advance, rifles raised. Penelope squeezed the trigger and the Winchester barked. the bullet kicking up dust 5 feet in front of the lead man, who stopped immediately. "The next shot will not miss," she shouted. From the rocks above came a sound that made everyone freeze. A voice calling out in Apache, loud and clear. Nantan appeared on a high outcropping, flanked by his warriors, all of them visible now, and he called down in English, 20 white men with guns against 1 woman in a chair and 1 man with no voice. "Is this what you call justice?" The sheriff looked up, startled. "This is not your concern, Apache. This is a legal matter." Nantan laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Everything that happens on this land is our concern. It was our land before it was yours, and we say that what you do here today is not law. It is theft and murder, and we will tell everyone what we witnessed." Hargrave's face went red. "Those savages are threatening us." "Sheriff, that is grounds for arrest." "They are not threatening," the sheriff said quietly. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. They are watching. There is a difference. Then ignore them and do your job." The sheriff looked at Penelope, at Daklugi, at the Apache on the rocks, and something in his face changed. Disgust replacing determination. "No," he said finally, "I will not do this." "What?" Hargrave snarled. "I said no," the sheriff repeated louder now. "I'm a peace officer, not an executioner. This woman has broken no law that I can prove, and I will not burn her alive to satisfy your greed." Hargrave's hand went to his gun. "Then you are relieved of duty. I will handle this myself." The sheriff's deputies shifted uneasily, several of them lowering their rifles. And in that moment Penelope saw the mob's unity fracturing, saw men remembering they had families and reputations, that murder was harder to justify when witnesses were watching. Hargrave saw it too, and his face twisted with rage. "Fine," he screamed, "you are all cowards, but I have men who are not afraid to do what needs to be done." He turned to his hired guns. Kill them both, and I will pay double your rate." The hired guns exchanged glances, calculating, and 4 of them raised their rifles. Daklugi stepped forward. Bow raised, arrow nocked, from the rocks. The Apache warriors stood, bows ready. And from the east came a new sound, more hoofbeats, many of them. Everyone turned to see a column of riders approaching, at least 30 men. And at their head rode Miguel Sandoval with a Mexican flag flying from a lance. He reined in at the edge of the confrontation and called out in a voice that carried across the desert. "I am Miguel Sandoval, holder of a Spanish land grant that predates American territorial claims, and I say that this woman is under my protection, as are all neighbors who border my property, and I have brought witnesses from 3 counties to observe that justice is done here today." Behind him, Penelope could see ranchers and farmers she recognized, white and Mexican, and even a few Chinese workers from the railroad. People her father had helped over the years, coming now to repay that debt. Hargrave looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed narrative collapsing, seeing too many witnesses, too many people who would tell the true story. "This is not over," he screamed. "I have the law on my side." Miguel laughed. "The law," he said, "belongs to whoever has the most witnesses, and we are watching, all of us." The hired guns lowered their rifles one by one, calculating that no amount of money was worth fighting against this many people. Hargrave sat on his horse, shaking with fury, and then he turned and rode away, his men following, leaving the deputies standing confused and ashamed. The sheriff dismounted and walked forward slowly, stopping at the edge of Penelope's porch. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have refused from the start." Penelope looked at him for a long moment. "You did refuse," she said finally, "when it mattered, and that took courage." The sheriff nodded, remounted, and led his deputies away. Miguel rode forward, grinning. "You called my bluff," Penelope said, shaking her head. "No bluff," Miguel replied. "Your father helped every person here at some point. We remember. The Apache warriors came down from the rocks, and Nantan approached. "The woman has strong friends," he said to Daklugi. "Guard her well." Then they mounted and rode away, melting into the landscape like they had never been there. Penelope sat on her porch surrounded by neighbors who had become defenders, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. 3 days after Hargrave's retreat, the storm that had been threatening finally broke over the valley. Rain falling in sheets so thick you could barely see 20 feet, turning the roads to rivers of mud and the desert floor into a treacherous bog that swallowed wagon wheels and horse hooves alike. Penelope sat by the window watching water cascade off the roof in silvery curtains, listening to the drumbeat of rain against adobe walls, and feeling something she had not felt in years, a sense of breathing room, of time purchased at great cost, but time nonetheless. Daklugi had spent the last 2 days reinforcing the house, patching the bullet holes with fresh adobe, replacing rotted timbers with wood Miguel had brought, turning their home into something that might actually withstand another siege if it came to that. But more important than the physical repairs were the alliances that had formed in the aftermath of the confrontation. Miguel had returned the day after with a lawyer from Albuquerque, a sharp-eyed man named Tobias Reed, who specialized in land disputes and had a reputation for fighting territorial corruption. Reed had spent hours going through Penelope's papers, examining every document with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that wars were won or lost on the strength of evidence. The deed her father had won in that poker game back in 1858 with proper witnesses and notarization, the marriage contract with Samuel Crowe drafted by a traveling notary and filed with the county clerk, the forged documents Hargrave had filed claiming unpaid debts with signatures that did not match and dates that contradicted public records. And his conclusion after this exhaustive review was both encouraging and deeply troubling. "You have a strong case," he told her, sitting at the table with documents spread before him like a battle map, each paper weighted down with stones to keep the breeze from scattering them. Hargrave's claims are built on fabricated loans and suspicious court orders signed by judges who have financial ties to his development company. Any honest judge would throw them out immediately and possibly file criminal charges against Hargrave for fraud. "But," Penelope said, hearing the unspoken qualifier in his tone, feeling her brief hope already beginning to curdle, "but Judge Harrison, who signed the warrant against you, is in Hargrave's pocket. Has been for years, according to court records I examined," Reed continued, his finger tapping on a particular document. "And the territorial governor is more concerned with keeping wealthy investors happy than protecting individual property rights. There is an election coming, and Hargrave has contributed heavily to his campaign. The winning in court here will require us to go over their heads, to appeal to federal authorities who have jurisdiction over territorial malfeasance." "How long will that take?" she asked, though she already knew she would not like the answer. "Months at minimum, maybe a year if the federal courts are backed up, which they usually are," Reed said honestly. "And during that time, Hargrave will continue trying to force you off this land through legal harassment, filing liens and injunctions, and physical intimidation, burning crops, poisoning wells, whatever it takes to break your will before federal review can proceed. So what do we do in the meantime? How do we survive?" Reed leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze of someone weighing options and finding most of them inadequate. His fingers steepled under his chin. "We need to make this case public. Get newspapers involved from multiple cities, federal investigators who cannot be bought, maybe even congressmen who oppose the Territorial Land Office's systematic corruption. We need to make you into a symbol that is too visible to quietly eliminate. Someone whose death or displacement would create a scandal that reaches Washington." Penelope felt her stomach knot with anxiety and something close to revulsion. "You want to turn me into a spectacle, a crippled woman for people to gawk at and pity?" Reed shook his head firmly. "I want to turn you into a hero, a disabled woman defending her dead father's legacy against corrupt officials and hired guns. That is a story that sells papers and embarrasses politicians. And embarrassed politicians take action to protect their own reputations. Public pressure is often more effective than legal arguments." She looked at Daklugi, who stood by the door, his expression unreadable. "What do you think?" He made a sign that meant dangerous but necessary, like walking through fire to reach water. "So I agree to this. Then what? Then I take your story to the Santa Fe New Mexican, to the Denver papers, maybe even to the New York Tribune." Reed said, "I have contacts who owe me favors, and I make sure your face and your story are everywhere. We force the territorial government to investigate Hargrave properly or face national scrutiny. And if that makes Hargrave more desperate, then you make sure you are never alone," Reed said bluntly. "Desperate men do desperate things, but they also make mistakes, and mistakes leave evidence." Penelope agreed, signed the papers, making Reed her legal representative, and watched him ride away into the rain with a promise to return within 2 weeks with news. That night she could not sleep, her mind turning over possibilities and fears. What if the publicity made things worse? What if Hargrave killed her before the papers could print her story? What if she became famous only as a corpse, a cautionary tale about stubbornness and pride? She wheeled to the window and looked out at the darkness, broken only by occasional lightning flashes that turned the landscape into a stark, black-and-white photograph. Daklugi appeared beside her so quietly she did not hear him approach, and he placed something in her hand. It was another carving, this one larger than the bird, a figure of a woman in a chair, but the chair had wheels made of stars, and the woman's hands held lightning. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Is this how you see me?" He nodded, then signed. "You are stronger than you know, stronger than any storm." She held the carving close. "I am so tired of being strong," she whispered. "I just want to rest." Daklugi knelt beside her chair and took her hand, and his presence said what words could not. "Then rest, I will keep watch. You are not alone in this fight." The next morning brought a visitor neither of them expected. A young Apache woman riding a paint horse at full gallop despite the treacherous mud, soaked through from the rain that still fell in intermittent bursts. Her long black hair plastered to her face and shoulders, her doeskin dress heavy with water. Daklugi recognized her immediately through the window, and his hands moved in agitated signs, movements sharp and urgent in a way Penelope had never seen from him. His usual calm completely shattered. The woman dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, stumbling slightly in the mud, but recovering with the grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, and she approached the porch with quick, determined steps, her eyes finding Daklugi with an intensity that spoke of deep emotion, of shared history that went back years. She spoke in Apache, rapid and urgent, words tumbling over each other in her haste to deliver her message. And Daklugi responded in signs, his face a mask of controlled alarm, and Penelope could only watch helplessly as a conversation unfolded that she could not understand, feeling like an outsider in her own home. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the woman turned to Penelope and spoke in halting English, each word carefully chosen and pronounced with effort. "I'm Isla, daughter of Nantan, who you met 3 days past. I come with warning that cannot wait for rain to stop." "What warning?" Penelope asked, her chest tight with dread. "The men you fight, the land assessor and his hired killers, they go to Fort Stanton 2 days ago. They ask for soldiers to come arrest Daklugi. They say he is renegade who attacked lawmen without cause. They show papers with judge's seal that say he must go to reservation or hang for crimes against the territory." Penelope's blood went cold, her hands gripping the arms of her chair until her knuckles went white. "When will they come?" 3 days, maybe 4 if rain continues to slow them. But they will come with many soldiers and papers that say he must be taken. And once he's in their custody, she paused, meeting Daklugi's eyes with sorrow. "Accidents happen to Apache prisoners. Everyone knows this. Can he run? Hide with your people in the mountains where soldiers cannot find him?" Ela shook her head emphatically. "If he runs, they will use it as proof of guilt. And they will hunt all Apache to punish us for hiding him. They will use him as excuse to break treaties and force more of our people onto reservations. My father says he must stay and prove innocence through white man's law." But how can Apache prove innocence to white courts that do not allow us to speak? Penelope looked at Daklugi, saw the resignation in his face, the understanding that this moment had always been coming, that his freedom had been borrowed time purchased with silence and vigilance. "No," she said firmly, with more conviction than she felt. "We will not let them take you. We will fight this." Isla stepped closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one to overhear. "There is more you must know, my father," says the land assessor. "He offers reward for Daklugi, $500 in gold to any man who brings proof of death or capture. He has printed papers and distributed them in every town and mining camp within 100 miles. $500 was a fortune in this territory, enough to tempt even honest men into betrayal." "We need to leave," Penelope said. "Both of us. Go to Mexico or California." Daklugi shook his head and signed, "If we run, your case is lost. Court will say you abandoned property. Hargrave wins everything. Then what do we do?" Isla reached into her shirt and pulled out a leather pouch. "My father sends this, proof that Daklugi saved your life. Proof that you were attacked first." Penelope opened the pouch and found something unexpected. A journal, the pages water-stained but readable. And as she flipped through it, her heart began to race. It was Samuel Crow's journal, entries dated up to the day he died. And the last entry described meeting with Hargrave's men on the road. Described them demanding he abandon the marriage contract. Described them drawing guns when he refused. "Where did you get this?" "We found it on the road where he was killed," Isla said. "My people saw what happened, but could not testify. But his own words, these can speak in court." Penelope clutched the journal like it was made of gold. "This proves Hargrave had Samuel murdered." Isla nodded. "My father says give this to your lawyer. Make the story public before soldiers come. Make them choose between arresting Daklugi and arresting the man who ordered murder." It was brilliant strategy. Force the authorities to pick a side before they could manufacture a narrative. Penelope looked at Daklugi. "We need to get this to Reed immediately." Daklugi signed. "Rain makes travel impossible. Roads are flooded. Then we wait for the rain to stop and we ride fast." Isla mounted her horse. "I must return before my absence is noticed. But know this, white woman, my people watch over you and Daklugi. If soldiers come to kill rather than arrest, we will know and we will respond." She rode off into the rain, vanishing like a ghost. The storm broke the next afternoon, clouds parting to reveal a sky scrubbed clean and impossibly blue. And Penelope and Daklugi prepared to ride to Santa Fe. Miguel arrived with a wagon and fresh horses. Having somehow anticipated their need, "I will drive," he said. "You cannot make that journey alone in your condition, and Daklugi should not be seen in town until we know the military's intentions." They loaded the wagon with supplies and Samuel's journal wrapped in oilcloth, and set out on roads that were still muddy but passable if you knew where the solid ground was. The journey took 2 days of hard travel, camping at night with Miguel, keeping watch while Penelope and Daklugi rested. And all the while Penelope felt time pressing down on them like a physical weight. They reached Santa Fe on the morning of the 3rd day and went straight to Reed's office, a small room above a mercantile that smelled of ink and paper. Reed's eyes widened when he saw Samuel's journal. "This changes everything," he said, reading through the entries. "This is evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, and if Hargrave ordered one killing, he likely ordered others." "Can you get it published?" "Better than that," Reed said. "I can get it submitted as evidence in a federal investigation. There is a territorial marshal named Wyatt Coleman who has been trying to build a case against land office corruption. This might be exactly what he needs." "How long?" "Give me 2 days to make copies and arrange meetings," Reed said. "But you should not stay in Santa Fe. If Hargrave has spies here, they will report your presence." "We will go to Miguel's ranch," Penelope said. They left Santa Fe that afternoon and headed south, taking back roads and avoiding settlements. And all the while Penelope felt like a rabbit running from wolves, knowing that somewhere behind them men with guns and badges were closing in. Miguel's ranch was a sprawling adobe compound nestled in a valley with good water from a natural spring and natural defensive positions where the hills created barriers against surprise attack. And his family welcomed them with the kind of warmth that felt like absolution, like coming home after years of wandering. His wife Rosa insisted on feeding them, despite their protests that they had eaten that morning, heaping clay plates with beans cooked with pork fat and cumin, fresh tortillas still hot from the griddle, and meat marinated in chilies that made Penelope's eyes water but tasted like heaven, and his children, 3 boys ranging from 8 to 15, with their mother's dark eyes and their father's quick smile, looked at Daklugi with a mixture of awe and a little fear. The way children look at legends come to life. "You are the one who fought off 20 men, the oldest boy said in Spanish, his voice cracking with adolescence and excitement. "My father says you moved like the wind and struck like lightning." Daklugi signed modestly with a hint of humor that Penelope had rarely seen from him. They fought poorly and stood too close together, made themselves easy targets. Miguel laughed, translating for his son, "Apache humor very dry. They find death and danger amusing because they have seen so much of both." That night, Penelope sat on the porch of the main house, watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky deepened from blue to purple to black, feeling safer than she had in weeks, but knowing it could not last. That this was just the eye of the storm, and the worst was still coming. Rosa came to sit beside her, bringing 2 cups of coffee sweetened with piloncillo, a small woman with grey threading her dark hair like silver rivers, and hands that never stopped moving, always mending or preparing or creating something useful from whatever materials were at hand. "Miguel told me your story," Rosa said softly in careful English, "about how you fight for your father's land against men who have no honor." Penelope nodded, not trusting her voice. "My mother did the same when I was young girl," Rosa continued, her eyes distant with memory. "After my father died from fever, she defended our grant against men who said a woman could not own property, that land must go to nearest male relative, even if that relative was distant cousin who never worked the soil. She won in the end, but it cost her years of her life in worry and struggle. She died young, worn out from fighting. Did she regret it?" Penelope asked quietly. Rosa smiled sadly, the expression transforming her weathered face. She said the only thing worth regretting was not fighting hard enough, that surrender is a poison that kills slowly from the inside. She taught me that our land is not just dirt and grass. It is memory and blood, and the promise we make to those who came before. To those who cleared the rocks and dug the wells and planted the first seeds, we owe them our resistance. Penelope felt tears rising. "I'm so tired of fighting." "Then let others fight beside you," Rosa said. "You do not have to carry this alone. That is why we have family, why we have friends, so the weight can be shared." 2 days later, Reed arrived with news, both good and terrible. "Marshal Coleman is investigating," he said, "and Samuel's journal has been entered into the federal record. But Hargrave knows, and he is moving fast. He has convinced a territorial judge to issue a warrant for Daklugi's arrest on charges of murder." "Murder?" Penelope said, shocked. "He killed no one. They are claiming he murdered one of Hargrave's men during the confrontation at your ranch." Reed said grimly, "A man named Jack Tully who apparently died from an arrow wound." "That is impossible," Penelope said. "Daklugi wounded several men, but killed none." Reed pulled out a newspaper, the Santa Fe New Mexican, and showed her the headline, "Renegade Apache Kills, Deputy in Land Dispute." The article described Daklugi as a violent savage who had attacked lawmen and killed a deputized citizen, with quotes from Sheriff Webb saying he had no choice but to bring Daklugi in, dead or alive. "This is all lies, I know," Reed said, "but lies printed in newspapers become truth in the public mind. We need to counter this immediately. How?" Reed pulled out another paper, this one from Denver, "By telling your story first. I have an interview scheduled with you tomorrow, and I have testimony from Miguel's neighbors who witnessed the confrontation. We are going to make this case so public that Hargrave cannot win without destroying his own reputation. And if he does not care about his reputation, then Marshal Coleman will arrest him first. Reed said, but we need time. Time for the investigation to progress. Time for federal authority to supersede territorial corruption. Time was the one thing they did not have. That night, soldiers arrived at Miguel's ranch. 10 cavalrymen, led by a lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave. He dismounted and approached the house with a warrant in hand. I'm looking for an Apache man called Daklugi, he said stiffly. I have orders to bring him in for questioning regarding the death of Jack Tully. Penelope wheeled onto the porch. He is innocent and I can prove it. The lieutenant looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I have my orders, and I have evidence that contradicts those orders. Federal evidence that is currently being reviewed by Marshal Coleman. The lieutenant hesitated. I cannot ignore a direct command. Miguel stepped forward. Lieutenant, my name is Miguel Sandoval. I hold a Spanish land grant that predates American authority in this territory. This ranch is legally under my jurisdiction, and I am telling you that if you attempt to arrest my guest without proper federal authorization, I will file a complaint that will reach Washington. The lieutenant looked between them, clearly torn. Finally, he said, I will report back to my commander that the suspect could not be located. That will buy you perhaps 2 days. But I strongly suggest you use that time to surrender to federal rather than territorial authority. He remounted, and his men followed. Riding back toward Fort Stanton, 2 days, Penelope said. Reed nodded grimly. Then we make them count. The interview with the Denver Post reporter happened in Miguel's parlor, a stuffy room that smelled of old leather and candle wax, with heavy wooden furniture that had crossed the plains in wagons 3 generations ago and somehow survived everything the frontier threw at it. The reporter was a woman, which surprised Penelope, middle-aged, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on her fingers. Her name was Catherine Mills, and she had a reputation for stories that made powerful men uncomfortable. She set up her notebook and pencils with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, then looked at Penelope with an expression that was both sympathetic and professionally detached. Tell me everything, she said from the beginning, and do not leave out the ugly parts. Those are usually where the truth lives. So Penelope talked. For 3 hours she talked about her father and his service in the war, about the accident that took her legs and the suspicious circumstances around it, about Samuel Crow and the marriage that was supposed to save her land, about finding him dead on the road with bullet holes that the territorial authorities called accidental. She talked about Clayton Hargrave and his systematic theft of land through legal manipulation, about the church where he struck her, about Daklugi appearing from the shadows to defend her when no one else would, about the siege at her ranch and the Apache warriors who witnessed everything, about Miguel and his neighbors who rode to her defense. Catherine's pencil moved constantly, filling page after page with shorthand that looked like ancient hieroglyphics. And occasionally she would stop Penelope to ask for clarification or to request specific details. Names and dates and amounts that could be verified. When Penelope finished, her voice hoarse from talking, Catherine set down her pencil and removed her spectacles to clean them, a gesture that seemed to be her way of thinking. This is bigger than one woman's land dispute, she said finally. This is about how the territorial system enables corruption, how men with money can buy justice while ordinary citizens have no recourse. Your story is the perfect illustration of a broken system. Will you write it? Penelope asked. I will write it, Catherine confirmed, and I will make sure it runs in every paper that will take it. Denver, San Francisco, maybe even New York, if I can convince my editor. But you need to understand something. Once this story publishes, you become a public figure. People will have opinions about you. Some will call you a hero, and some will call you a troublemaker. Hargrave will use every resource he has to discredit you. They will dig into your past looking for scandals. They will question your morals and your sanity. This will get worse before it gets better. Penelope thought of her father, of Samuel, of all the people who had suffered because of Hargrave's greed. Then let it get worse, she said. I'm tired of being quiet. Catherine smiled. A fierce expression that transformed her stern face. Good. The quiet ones never change anything. That evening, Reed returned from Santa Fe with Marshal Coleman, a compact man with a gray mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a federal badge and carried himself with the authority of someone who answered to Washington rather than territorial politicians. He listened to Penelope's story again, this time taking notes in a leather-bound journal, asking pointed questions about dates and witnesses, about documents and physical evidence. And when she produced Samuel's journal, his eyes lit up with professional satisfaction. "This is exactly what I needed," he said, reviewing the entries. "This, combined with testimony from the Apache witnesses and the neighbors who saw the confrontation, gives me enough to bring charges against Hargrave for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and attempted theft of federal land." "Federal land?" Penelope asked, confused. "I thought it was territorial." "Your father's deed predates the territorial charter," Coleman explained, "which means it falls under federal jurisdiction. Hargrave has been operating under the assumption that territorial courts would protect him, but he miscalculated. Federal charges cannot be dismissed by local judges. So you can arrest him. I can and I will. But first I need to secure Daklugi's safety. These murder charges against him are fabricated, but they give the territorial authorities an excuse to act. I need to take him into federal custody for his own protection." Daklugi, who had been standing silently by the door, signed rapidly to Penelope. "He says he will not hide behind federal protection while others risk themselves," she translated. Coleman studied Daklugi with respect. "I understand. But if you are killed or captured before this case goes to trial, Hargrave wins. He can claim you were a dangerous renegade and use your death to justify his actions. But if you are alive and can testify, even through an interpreter, you become a witness he cannot silence." Daklugi considered this, then signed a question. He asks how long he would be in custody. Penelope translated, "A few weeks at most. Until the trial," Coleman said, "you would be held at Fort Marcy in Santa Fe under my direct supervision, not as a prisoner but as a protected witness. You would have freedom of movement within the fort, and I give you my word as a federal officer that no harm will come to you." Daklugi looked at Penelope, the question clear in his eyes. She reached for his hand. "I think you should do it," she said softly. "Not because I want you to go, but because I want you to survive this. And Coleman is right. If you are alive to testify, we can end this." He nodded slowly, accepting the logic even if he did not like it. The next morning they prepared to leave for Santa Fe, Coleman providing an escort of 6 federal marshals who would ensure safe passage, and Miguel insisting on sending 2 of his most trusted men as additional security. Rosa packed food for the journey, enough to feed a small army, and pressed a small silver cross into Penelope's hand. "My mother gave this to me," she said. "It protected her through many troubles. Now it will protect you." Penelope tried to refuse, but Rosa closed her fingers around it. "Take it. You need all the protection you can get." The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days of hard riding, the party moving in tight formation with scouts ahead and behind, watching for ambush. And twice they saw riders in the distance who turned away when they spotted the federal badges. "Bounty hunters," Coleman said grimly. "Hargrave's reward has drawn every desperate man in the territory." They reached Santa Fe without incident and went directly to Fort Marcy, a military installation built on a hill overlooking the city, with thick adobe walls and a commanding view of all approaches. Coleman arranged quarters for Daklugi in the officers' section, a small room with a real bed and a window that looked out over the mountains. And he posted guards not to keep Daklugi in, but to keep others out. Penelope was given rooms in the fort's guest quarters, normally reserved for visiting dignitaries, and for the first time in weeks she felt something approaching safety. That night, Catherine's story published in the Denver Post with the headline, "Crippled Woman Fights Land Theft While Territory Looks Away." Reed brought her a copy the next morning, and Penelope read with trembling hands. The article was devastating. Catherine had painted Hargrave as a villain straight from a dime novel, a corrupt land assessor who used legal trickery to steal from widows and orphans, who ordered murders and bribed officials, who represented everything wrong with territorial governance. But more importantly, she had painted Penelope as something more than a victim, as a fighter who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds, as a symbol of ordinary citizens pushed past their breaking point by systematic corruption. The article included quotes from Miguel, from neighbors who witnessed the confrontation, and even a brief interview with Nantan conducted through an interpreter, adding Apache perspective to what had been presented as a simple property dispute. By noon, the story had been picked up by papers in San Francisco and Chicago. By evening, it reached New York, and within 3 days, Penelope received telegrams from as far away as Boston expressing support and offering help. But there was also Backlash, the Santa Fe New Mexican, which had financial ties to Hargrave, published a counter-article claiming Penelope was a fraud who manipulated public sympathy, that she had conspired with a violent Apache to intimidate legitimate business interests, that the whole story was fabricated to avoid paying legitimate debts. They called Daklugi a savage and a murderer, claimed he had killed multiple men during the confrontation at the ranch, printed testimony from Sheriff Webb that contradicted everything Penelope had said. Reed was furious. "This is libel," he said. "We should sue." Coleman shook his head. "Better to let them dig their own grave. Every lie they print can be disproven in court, and the more desperate they sound, the more guilty Hargrave appears." The trial was set for 3 weeks from the date of Daklugi's protective custody, to be held in federal court with a judge appointed from outside the territory to avoid conflicts of interest. During those 3 weeks, Penelope lived in a strange limbo, safe behind fort walls but unable to return home, watching as her story became national news, and her face appeared in political cartoons and editorial pages across the country. Some portrayed her as a heroic frontier woman, others as a hysterical cripple being manipulated by lawyers and journalists. And she learned to ignore both versions because neither was really her. They were just symbols people projected their own beliefs onto. Daklugi adapted to fort life with the quiet acceptance of someone who had survived worse. He helped the blacksmith repair tools, taught some of the younger soldiers how to track and read signs, spent hours carving small figures that he gave to children who lived on the post. Penelope visited him daily, and they would sit in comfortable silence. Sometimes she would read to him from the newspapers, translating the articles into simple terms and watching his reactions. And sometimes they just watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. 1 week before the trial, Reed came to her with news that made her heart stop. "Hargrave has been arrested," he said. "Coleman moved this morning with federal marshals and took him into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud and corruption of territorial officials." "Is it over?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. Reed hesitated. "The charges are filed and the evidence is strong. But Hargrave has expensive lawyers and political connections. He will fight this with everything he has. The trial will determine everything." That night Penelope could not sleep, her mind racing through possibilities. What if Hargrave was acquitted? What if his lawyers found some technicality? What if the judge was secretly on his payroll despite the federal appointment? She wheeled herself out onto the fort's ramparts and looked out over Santa Fe, sleeping under a blanket of stars. Daklugi found her there, moving silently as always, and he sat beside her on the stone wall. She did not ask how he got past the guards. Some questions were better left unasked. "I am scared," she admitted, the first time she had said it aloud. He took her hand and signed with the other. "Fear is wisdom. It keeps us alert. But do not let it stop you from moving forward. What if we lose?" He signed again. "Then we fought. And that matters more than winning. We stood when others would have fallen. We spoke when others were silent. That is worth something." She squeezed his hand. "When this is over, whatever happens, I want you to know that you saved me. Not just my life, but my sense of who I am. You reminded me that I am more than this chair, more than my limitations." He signed. "And you reminded me that I am more than my silence, more than my scars." They sat together as the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead. Two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and forged something unbreakable. Tomorrow the final battle would begin. But tonight they had this moment of peace, and that was enough. The federal courthouse in Santa Fe was packed beyond capacity on the morning the trial began. People standing in the aisles and crowding the doorways. Journalists from a dozen newspapers fighting for seats in the gallery. And outside on the plaza, at least 200 citizens gathered to hear the proceedings, relayed by runners who darted in and out with updates. Penelope sat in the front row with Reed beside her, Daklugi standing behind her chair like a sentinel, his presence drawing stares and whispers from those who had only read about the silent Apache warrior and now saw him in flesh and bone. Clayton Hargrave sat at the defense table flanked by 3 expensive lawyers in suits that cost more than most men earned in a year, his face carefully composed, but his hands betraying his nervousness. Fingers drumming constantly on the table until one of his lawyers placed a hand over them to make them stop. The judge was a severe woman named Harriet Blackwood, appointed directly from the Department of Interior, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with a reputation for brooking no nonsense from either side. And when she entered the courtroom and everyone rose, Penelope felt a surge of hope, because this was a judge who could not be bought. The prosecution was led by Marshal Coleman himself, assisted by 2 federal attorneys who had reviewed every piece of evidence with the thoroughness of men who knew this case would set precedent for how territorial corruption was handled. Coleman's opening statement was precise and devastating, laying out a pattern of systematic theft spanning 5 years, documenting 17 separate instances where Hargrave had used fraudulent liens and forged documents to steal land from citizens who lacked the resources to fight back in court. "But this case," Coleman said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "is about more than property theft. It is about a man who ordered murder to cover his crimes, who struck a disabled woman in a church, who used the apparatus of law as a weapon against the innocent, and who represents everything our federal system was designed to prevent." Hargrave's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Thurston Webb, who had successfully defended robber barons and railroad magnates, stood for the defense opening with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case. "My client is a respected businessman who has contributed significantly to the economic development of this territory." Webb said smoothly, "He is the victim of a coordinated campaign by disgruntled debtors who refuse to pay legitimate obligations. The woman at the center of this case is tragically disabled, but that does not exempt her from the law. And the Apache who stands behind her is a known associate of renegade bands who have attacked settlers throughout this region." Penelope felt anger rising, but Reed's hand on her arm steadied her. He had warned her that defense lawyers would try to paint her as either a liar or a fool, and she needed to remain calm no matter what they said. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution called witness after witness. People Hargrave had stolen from, officials he had bribed, clerks who had falsified documents under his orders, each testimony building a wall of evidence that grew higher and more damning with each passing hour. Miguel testified about the confrontation at Penelope's ranch, about seeing Hargrave order his men to burn her out, about the Apache witnesses who had observed everything from the rocks above. Catherine Mills testified about her investigation, about the patterns of corruption she had uncovered, about territorial officials who confirmed off the record that Hargrave had been operating with impunity for years. The most powerful testimony came from a clerk named Thomas Yates, who had worked in Hargrave's office for 3 years and finally broke under the weight of his conscience. He brought ledgers showing payments to judges and sheriffs, forged signatures on loan documents, and most damning of all, a receipt for payment to two men identified only as Jack and Sam for services rendered on the road to Santa Fe on the exact date Samuel Crowe was killed. The defense tried to discredit Yates as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the documents spoke for themselves, numbers and dates that could not be explained away. On the fourth day, Penelope was called to testify. Reed had prepared her extensively, but nothing could quite prepare her for the feeling of wheeling herself to the witness stand while hundreds of eyes watched, while Hargrave stared at her with barely concealed hatred, while the judge waited with patient expectation. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and then she told her story one more time, from her father's death to the church confrontation to the siege at her ranch. And this time her voice did not shake. This time she looked directly at Hargrave as she spoke and watched his mask slip, watched fury and fear war for control of his face. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned her memory, suggested her disability had affected her judgment, implied that she had invented the relationship with Samuel Crowe to avoid debt collectors. But Penelope had lived through too much to be intimidated by a lawyer's tricks. When he asked if she had any proof that Hargrave had ordered Samuel's murder, she simply pointed to the journal that lay in evidence. Samuel's own words, she said quietly, written the day he died, describing the threats made against him. That is my proof. On the fifth day, the prosecution did something unprecedented. They called Nantin to testify. Apache testimony was not normally admissible in territorial courts, but this was a federal trial, and Judge Blackwood ruled that any witness who could provide relevant testimony would be heard. Nantin entered the courtroom in traditional Apache clothing, his bearing proud and unbowed, and he spoke through an interpreter provided by the War Department. A lieutenant who had served in the Apache campaigns and learned the language. He described watching the confrontation from the rocks, seeing Hargrave order his men to attack Penelope, seeing Daklugi defend her with minimal force designed to scatter rather than kill. And he stated clearly that if Hargrave's man Jack Tully had died, it was not from any wound Daklugi inflicted. The defense tried to discredit him, suggesting Apache witnesses could not be trusted. But Judge Blackwood shut that down immediately. In my courtroom, she said sharply, testimony is evaluated on its merit and credibility, not on the race of the witness. Continue with relevant questions or sit down. Webb sat down. On the sixth day, Daklugi was called to testify. He could not speak, but he could write, and the court provided him with a slate and chalk. And through this painstaking method, he answered every question put to him by Coleman. He described finding Penelope alone in the church, seeing Hargrave's men attack her, making the decision to intervene because it was the right thing to do, and when asked why he had stayed to protect her all these years, he wrote simply, because her father saved my life, and because she is family. The defense declined to cross-examine, perhaps sensing that attacking a man who could not speak in his own defense would turn the jury against them. Closing arguments took most of the seventh day. Coleman summarized the evidence with the precision of a prosecutor who knew he had won. Document after document, witness after witness, building an irrefutable case that Hargrave was guilty of everything charged and more. Webb made a passionate plea for his client, arguing that successful men always attracted jealousy and false accusations, that the prosecution had failed to prove intent, that the evidence was circumstantial and the witnesses unreliable, but even he seemed to know it was futile. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman was a rancher named John Morrison, who had served on the Territorial Council and resigned in protest over corruption. Judge Blackwood asked for the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find guilty? On the charge of fraud and falsification of documents, guilty. On the charge of bribery of territorial officials, guilty. The list went on, guilty on all 17 counts. And with each word, Hargrave seemed to shrink in his chair until he looked like what he truly was, a small, cruel man whose empire of theft had finally crumbled. Judge Blackwood set sentencing for 1 week later, and when that day came, she showed no mercy. 20 years in federal prison, she declared, plus restitution to all victims identified by the marshal's investigation, all properties obtained through fraudulent means to be returned to their rightful owners, and a formal apology to be published in every newspaper that covered this trial. Hargrave was led away in chains, still protesting his innocence, still claiming he was the victim, but no one was listening anymore. Outside the courthouse, Penelope was surrounded by well-wishers and journalists, people wanting to shake her hand or simply touch her chair as if she were some kind of talisman. Catherine Mills fought through the crowd to reach her. "You did it," she said, grinning. "You actually did it." "We did it," Penelope corrected, "all of us together." That evening there was a celebration at Miguel's ranch, a feast with musicians playing and children running wild, and people dancing under strings of paper lanterns that turned the night into something magical. Penelope sat with Daklugi on the porch, watching the festivities, and for the first time in years she felt something that might actually be peace. Reed approached with papers in hand. "Your land is officially yours again," he said. "No liens. No contested claims, free and clear. And there is one more thing." "What?" "Judge Blackwood has authorized a federal investigation into the circumstances of your accident. The one that left you unable to walk. There is evidence suggesting it was not random, that Hargrave may have been involved even back then." Penelope felt cold. "Can we prove it?" "Maybe, maybe not, but we will try. Justice delayed is better than justice denied." 3 months later, Penelope and Daklugi returned to her ranch, to land that was finally irrevocably hers. The house had been repaired and expanded with help from Miguel and his sons. New rooms added, the roof reinforced. A proper ramp built for her chair. Nantan came to visit, bringing gifts of blankets woven by the women of his band. And he told Daklugi that he was always welcome in the mountains, that he had proven himself worthy of the Apache name he carried. Life settled into a rhythm of planting and harvest, of neighbors helping neighbors, of Daklugi teaching local children to track and Penelope teaching them to read, creating a small school on her property where Apache and white and Mexican children learned together. 2 years after the trial, on a spring morning, when the desert was covered in wildflowers, Penelope and Daklugi were married by a circuit judge who happened to be passing through, with Miguel and Rosa and half the territory as witnesses. It was not the wedding she had once imagined. There was no church, no white dress, no traditional vows spoken aloud. Instead, they stood, Daklugi on his feet and Penelope risen from her chair with his support, beneath a cottonwood tree her father had planted, and they signed their names on a certificate that made official what had been true for years. Seen, they were family, they were partners, they were home. And as the sun set over the mountains, turning the sky to fire, Penelope looked at the man beside her, the silent warrior who had become her voice when she had none, her strength when hers failed, her proof that love did not require words to be real. She thought of her father and Samuel, of all those who had been lost along the way, and she knew they would approve. The land was saved, justice had been served, and 2 people who the world had tried to break had instead become unbreakable, together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.